think you know fear? You think you understand what it means to be hunted? Wait until the world itself turns against you. Until the very air you breathe tastes of ancient malice, and every rustle in the dark promises a fate far worse than death. Some nightmares aren't just in your head, they're waiting in the shadows.
My name is Alara Vance, and I was drowning. Not in water, but in debt, in expectation, in the suffocating silence of a world that had no place for a freshly minted environmental science graduate with a mountain of student loans and a resume as thin as a whisper. Every door I knocked on remained stubbornly shut, every application a black hole. The city, once a beacon of opportunity, had become a concrete cage, its relentless hum a constant reminder of my failure. Then, like a mirage in the desert of my despair, I found it, an online posting, almost too obscure to be real. Wildlife Research Assistant, Remote American Wilderness. The description was vague, tantalizingly so. It spoke of pristine forests, untouched ecosystems, and a chance to work with nature, a siren song to a girl who'd grown up in the quiet embrace of a small, isolated town, where the rustle of leaves was more familiar than the roar of traffic. The pay, frankly, was obscene, a lifeline thrown to a sinking soul. It felt too good to be true, and a part of me, the part that still clung to a shred of common sense, screamed a warning. But desperation is a powerful intoxicant, and I was drunk on the promise of escape, of a fresh start, of finally putting my degree to some use. I packed my life into a single duffel bag, leaving behind the stifling expectations and the judging glances. The journey was long, a blur of planes, rental cars, and finally, a battered pickup truck driven by a man whose face was as craggy as the mountains we were traversing. He spoke little, his eyes, when they met mine in the rearview mirror, held a strange, unsettling depth, like ancient pools reflecting forgotten secrets. The paved roads gave way to gravel, then to dirt tracks, and finally, to nothing but a faint trail winding deeper and deeper into a forest so dense it felt like the world was swallowing us whole. The trees, ancient and towering, formed a cathedral of green, their branches interwoven to block out the sun, casting the forest floor in an eternal twilight. When we finally arrived, it was less an outpost and more a collection of weathered cabins huddled together in a small clearing, dwarfed by the colossal pines that surrounded them. A single imposing building, more modern than the rest, stood apart, its windows dark and uninviting. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth, a primal perfume that filled my lungs and for the first time in months, eased the knot of anxiety in my chest. This was it. My sanctuary. My escape. I stepped out of the truck, the silence of the forest pressing in, a silence so profound it felt like a living thing. It was peaceful, almost overwhelmingly so. Too peaceful, perhaps. But I was too tired, too relieved, to notice the subtle tremor beneath the surface, the faint, almost imperceptible hum of something ancient and hungry stirring in the depths of the woods. The first few weeks were a balm to my frayed nerves. The air was clean, the solitude a welcome change from the constant clamor of city life. My cabin was small but cozy, with a wood-burning stove that crackled companionably in the evenings. My duties, as outlined by a series of pre-recorded messages left on a rugged satellite phone, seemed straightforward enough. Tracking local wildlife, deer, bears, the occasional elk, collecting plant samples, and maintaining the various pieces of equipment scattered throughout the designated research zones. It was simple, almost meditative work. I spent my days hiking through the ancient woods, my boots crunching on fallen leaves, the sunlight dappling through the canopy. I learned to identify the calls of different birds, to read the subtle signs of animal trails, to feel the rhythm of the forest. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of purpose, a quiet contentment that settled deep in my bones. But even in this idyllic setting, there were whispers. The isolation, initially a comfort, began to feel like a cage. No cell service, no internet, just the satellite phone for communication, and even that was strictly for work-related messages. The nearest town was a day's drive away, a tiny speck on the map, and I was told not to venture there without explicit permission. I was truly cut off, a tiny island in a vast green ocean. The silence, too, became a character in itself. Sometimes it was too profound, a heavy, unnatural quiet that pressed in on me, making my ears ring. It wasn't the vibrant silence of a thriving ecosystem, but something deeper, more ominous, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Then there were the sounds at night. At first I dismissed them as the normal nocturnal symphony of the wilderness, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of a raccoon. But as the weeks wore on, they grew stranger, more unsettling. Howls unlike any wolf or coyote I'd ever heard, long and mournful, yet with an underlying current of something primal and fierce. Rustling in the undergrowth that didn't sound like the clumsy movements of a bear or the skittering of a deer, but something more deliberate, heavier. I'd lie awake, my heart thudding against my ribs, straining to identify the source, but the sounds would always fade before I could pinpoint them, leaving me with a lingering sense of unease. And the scientists. I rarely saw them. Their presence was a phantom limb, felt more than seen. They communicated through hushed tones carried on the wind, through the occasional glimpse of a shadowy figure disappearing into the imposing modern building, or through the cryptic, almost clinical messages on the satellite phone. They were secretive, their work shrouded in an impenetrable veil of mystery. Their equipment, too, was unsettling. Advanced, unfamiliar tech, some of it caged or secured behind reinforced doors, hinted at something far more complex, far more dangerous than simple wildlife research. I'd catch glimpses of strange sensors, of cameras pointed not at the animals, but at the perimeter of the camp, at me. A constant prickling sensation on the back of my neck, even when I was alone in my cabin, confirmed my growing suspicion. I was being watched. The peace I had found was a fragile illusion, and the whispers of the woods were growing louder, carrying a chilling secret I was about to uncover. The inconsistencies started small, almost imperceptible at first. My daily logs, meticulously filled with observations of deer herds and bear scat, began to diverge from the data I was supposed to be collecting. The GPS trackers on the local wildlife were showing movement patterns that defied logic, impossible speeds, and trajectories that crisscrossed the most impenetrable parts of the forest. Areas I knew, from my own extensive treks, were impassable for anything larger than a squirrel. I dismissed it as faulty equipment, or perhaps my own inexperience. But the nagging feeling persisted, a tiny burr under the saddle of my contentment. One afternoon, while tracking what I believed to be a particularly elusive elk, I stumbled upon it. A fence. Not a typical game fence, but something far more substantial, a gleaming, almost invisible mesh that hummed with a low, barely audible current. Warning signs in multiple languages were affixed to the posts, stark red against the green backdrop. Restricted area. Authorized personnel only. Extreme danger. My instructions had been clear, never deviate from the marked paths. But curiosity, that most dangerous of human traits, gnawed at me. I followed the fence line, a prickle of unease growing with every step until I found a small, camouflaged gate secured with a keypad. It was a foolish impulse, a reckless disregard for the rules that had until now kept me safe. But something compelled me forward. I didn't try to open it. Instead, I found a small gap in the foliage, a natural blind, and waited. Hours passed. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. Just as I was about to give up, a figure emerged from the dense woods on the other side of the fence. It was one of the scientists, a gaunt man with a perpetually furrowed brow, whom I'd only ever seen in passing. He was speaking into a device, his voice low and urgent, but the wind carried snippets of his words to me. Parameters aggressive breeding specimen. My blood ran cold. Breeding. What were they breeding out here, in the heart of this ancient forest that required such secrecy, such security? I returned to my cabin that night, the peace of the forest shattered. The sounds that had once been merely unsettling now took on a sinister quality. The howls especially. They were closer now, more frequent, and imbued with a raw, predatory hunger that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I started cross-referencing my data with old wildlife journals I'd found in the cabin, dusty tomes filled with observations of local fauna. Nothing matched. The tracks I was seeing, the scat I was collecting, they belonged to something larger, something more powerful, something that shouldn't exist in these woods. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place a few days later. I was in the main building, ostensibly restocking supplies, when I heard voices from the lab. The door was ajar and I couldn't resist. Peeking inside, I saw a holographic projection, a detailed anatomical rendering of a wolf. But this wasn't any wolf I recognized. Its skeletal structure was more robust, its teeth longer, its skull broader. And then I heard the words clear as a bell from the gaunt scientist. The ancient lineage. We've done it. The Canis Durus is back. And the girl, she's proving to be in excellent control. Her presence keeps them stimulated, keeps their instincts sharp. My breath hitched. Canis Durus, dire wolves extinct for thousands of years, and then the chilling realization, a cold, hard fist to my gut, excellent control. Her presence keeps them stimulated. I wasn't a research assistant. I was a variable. I was bait. The peaceful forest, my sanctuary, had become a meticulously crafted trap, and I, Alara Vance, was the lure for a resurrected horror. The howls outside were no longer just unsettling, they were a promise. A promise of teeth and hunger, and a very long, very painful death. The world tilted on its axis. The air in the lab, once sterile and cold, now felt thick with a suffocating dread. Dire wolves. And I was the bait. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. My mind reeled, trying to reconcile the idyllic peace of the past weeks with this monstrous truth. The vague job description, the isolation, the secretive scientists, the strange equipment, the unsettling sounds at night, it all coalesced into a horrifying tapestry of deception. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at my throat. I wanted to scream, to confront them, to demand answers. But a deeper, more primal instinct, the one that had kept me alive through years of struggle, whispered caution. They wouldn't explain. They wouldn't apologize. They would simply dispose of me. I was a loose end, a witness to their unspeakable act. My only chance was to disappear, to become as elusive as the shadows that danced in the ancient forest. I backed away from the lab door, my movements slow, deliberate, as if any sudden sound would shatter the fragile illusion of my invisibility. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the otherwise silent corridor. I made it back to my cabin, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the lock. Inside, I moved with a desperate urgency, stuffing a few essentials into my worn backpack. A small first aid kit, a knife I used for cutting samples, a water bottle, and a handful of energy bars. Every rustle outside, every creak of the cabin sent a jolt of terror through me. I was no longer a researcher, I was prey. The forest, once my sanctuary, now loomed as a terrifying labyrinth. The towering pines, which had offered solace, now seemed to press in, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching for me. The familiar paths, once a comfort, now felt like a snare, leading me deeper into the heart of the monster's lair. I knew I couldn't follow them. They would be watched, monitored. My only hope was to go off-trail, to disappear into the untamed wilderness, to become one with the shadows. I slipped out of the cabin under the cloak of twilight, the last vestiges of the sun bleeding across the horizon, painting the sky in hues of blood orange and bruised purple. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, but now, underlying it, was a faint metallic tang like old blood. I moved silently, my feet barely disturbing the fallen leaves, my senses hyper-alert. Every snapping twig, every distant hoot of an owl, sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I could feel their eyes on me, even though I saw no one. The scientists, the dire wolves, they were out there, a silent, unseen threat waiting. The hunt had begun, and I was the quarry. The first night was a blur of primal fear and desperate movement. I pushed deeper into the forest, away from the faint glow of the outpost, away from the hum of their monstrous machines. My environmental science degree, once a symbol of academic achievement, was now my only weapon. I knew the basics of survival: how to find potable water, how to identify edible plants, how to build a rudimentary shelter. But theory and practice are two different beasts, especially when the forest itself feels alive with unseen threats. I found a small overhang, a natural rock formation that offered some meager protection from the elements. Huddled beneath it, wrapped in the thin emergency blanket I'd had the foresight to grab, every shadow seemed to writhe, every rustle of leaves a predator's approach. The howls began around midnight, closer now, a chorus of ancient, guttural cries that vibrated through the very ground beneath me. They weren't the familiar, mournful cries of a lone wolf, but a symphony of hunger, a pack on the hunt. My breath hitched in my throat, and I pressed myself further into the cold rock, willing myself to become invisible. The next few days blurred into a grueling cycle of movement and hiding. I ate what I could find: berries, roots, a few grubs when hunger became unbearable. My body ached, my muscles screamed in protest, but the fear was a constant, sharp spur. I learned to move with a new kind of stealth, my steps light, my eyes constantly scanning the dense undergrowth. The forest, once a place of serene beauty, was now a hostile, alien landscape, every tree a potential hiding place for a lurking horror. My first direct encounter with them was a nightmare made real. I was crossing a small clearing, my guard momentarily down, when a shadow detached itself from the deeper woods. It was massive, easily twice the size of any wolf I'd ever seen, its fur a mottled gray, its eyes glowing with an unnatural, predatory intelligence. Its teeth, when it snarled, were like daggers, long and yellowed, dripping with saliva. It wasn't alone. From the periphery of my vision, more shadows emerged, flanking me, cutting off any escape. The air crackled with their presence, a primal energy that spoke of ancient power and untamed savagery. I froze, my heart a frantic hummingbird in my chest. Every instinct screamed to run, but my legs were rooted to the spot. The lead wolf, the alpha, took a step closer, its gaze fixed on me, assessing, calculating. I could feel the heat of its breath, the raw power coiled within its massive frame. This wasn't just an animal, it was a living, breathing nightmare, a ghost from a forgotten age. I remembered the scientist's words: her presence keeps them stimulated, keeps their instincts sharp. I was not just bait, I was a training dummy, a living target for their resurrected monsters. Then a distant, almost imperceptible hum. The wolves, as if on cue, turned their heads, their ears swiveling. A low growl rumbled in the alpha's chest, a sound of frustration, not fear. They melted back into the shadows as quickly as they had appeared, leaving me trembling, gasping for air in the sudden, terrifying silence. It was a drone, I realized, a faint, whirring sound that had saved me. The scientists were watching. They weren't just breeding these horrors, they were observing their effectiveness, using me as a living experiment. The thought was almost as terrifying as the wolves themselves. I was trapped in a macabre game, a pawn in their twisted quest for scientific glory, and the next encounter might not end with a timely intervention. The forest had teeth, and they were closing in. Days bled into weeks, marked only by the relentless gnawing of hunger and the ever-present chill that seeped into my bones. My clothes, once sturdy, were now tattered rags, snagging on thorns and offering little protection against the biting cold of the nights. My skin was a roadmap of scratches and bruises, my hair matted with dirt and pine needles. The mirror image of the confident, hopeful Alara Vance who had arrived here was long gone, replaced by a gaunt, wild-eyed creature, driven by a singular, desperate need: survival. Food became an obsession. I foraged relentlessly, my senses sharpened by desperation. Every berry, every root, every small, scurrying creature became a potential meal. I learned to set crude snares, my hands, once accustomed to the delicate precision of laboratory instruments, now adept at tying knots and camouflaging traps. The taste of raw rabbit, still warm with life, was no longer repulsive. It was sustenance, a fleeting victory against the encroaching emptiness. But the physical toll was nothing compared to the mental one. Sleep was a luxury I rarely afforded myself, haunted by the echoing howls and the phantom feeling of breath on my neck. When I did manage to drift off, my dreams were a kaleidoscope of snapping jaws and glowing eyes, of the gaunt scientist's chilling smile. Paranoia became my constant companion. Every rustle in the leaves, every distant crack of a twig, sent my heart racing. I saw shapes in the shadows, heard whispers in the wind. Was it the wolves? Or were the scientists, with their unseen drones and their chilling surveillance, always just beyond my sight, watching their experiment unfold? One afternoon, I found myself staring at my reflection in a still pool of water. My face was skeletal, my eyes sunken and bloodshot, reflecting a terror I barely recognized. A high, thin laugh escaped my lips, a sound that was not my own, and I stumbled back, horrified. Was I losing my mind? The isolation, the constant fear, the gnawing hunger, they were eroding the very foundations of my sanity. I started talking to myself, whispering reassurances, arguing with phantom voices, anything to fill the suffocating silence that threatened to swallow me whole. The wolves, too, seemed to be toying with me. They wouldn't always attack. Sometimes they would simply appear at the edge of my vision, their massive forms silhouetted against the trees, their eyes fixed on me with an unnerving intensity. They would follow me for miles, a silent, terrifying escort, their presence a constant reminder of my precarious position. I was their entertainment, their live-action documentary. I was the rabbit in the pen, and they were the hungry predators, learning, adapting, growing stronger with every passing moment. The scientists, I knew, were orchestrating this macabre dance, observing every twitch, every desperate scramble, every moment of my agonizing decline. I was a data point, a living graph charting the effectiveness of their resurrected monsters. And the thought, in its cold, clinical cruelty, was almost worse than the fear of being torn apart. Hope, a fragile, flickering flame, ignited within me when I stumbled upon it, a faint, almost overgrown trail. It wasn't a game trail, nor was it one of the scientists' meticulously maintained paths. This was older, a forgotten logging road, barely visible beneath years of fallen leaves and encroaching undergrowth. It was a sign, a faint echo of humanity in this vast, terrifying wilderness. I followed it, my steps renewed with a desperate energy, the thought of civilization a distant, shimmering mirage. The wolves, however, were not so easily deterred. Their presence became more insistent, their howls a constant, chilling accompaniment to my desperate trek. They seemed to know I was nearing the edge of their domain, and they were determined to make me pay for my escape. I could hear them, always just out of sight, their heavy paws thudding on the forest floor, their guttural growls a constant reminder of the fate that awaited me if I faltered. The climax came at the edge of a wide, fast-flowing river. The logging road ended abruptly, swallowed by the churning water. On the other side, I could see it, a faint, almost imperceptible shimmer of light, a sign of human habitation. But between me and salvation stood the pack. They emerged from the tree line, a dozen massive, shadowy forms, their eyes gleaming in the fading light. The alpha, the one with the scarred muzzle and the unnerving intelligence, stood at the forefront, its gaze fixed on me, a silent challenge. There was no escape. No hiding. This was it. My final stand. My mind, stripped bare by weeks of terror and deprivation, focused with a terrifying clarity. I was no longer just Alara Vance, the environmental science graduate. I was a survivor, a creature honed by the wilderness, and I would not go down without a fight. I grabbed a heavy branch, its rough bark a comfort in my trembling hands. My breath hitched, but it wasn't from fear, it was from a surge of pure, unadulterated rage. They had taken everything from me, my peace, my sanity, my very humanity. But they would not take my life. With a guttural roar that surprised even myself, I charged. It wasn't a strategic move, just a desperate primal lunge. The alpha met me, a blur of teeth and fur. I swung the branch, connecting with a sickening thud. It yelped, a sound of surprise more than pain, and recoiled. It was enough. A split second, a window of opportunity. I plunged into the icy river, the current immediately seizing me, pulling me downstream. The water was a freezing shock, stealing my breath, but I kicked and clawed, driven by the desperate need to reach the other side. I could hear the howls behind me, a cacophony of frustrated rage, but the river was too swift, too treacherous for them to follow. I don't know how long I was in the water. It felt like an eternity, a battle against the relentless current, against the encroaching cold, against the fading light. When my hands finally scraped against solid ground, I dragged myself out, my body numb, my lungs burning. I lay there for a long time, gasping, shivering, the faint glow of distant lights a beacon in the encroaching darkness. I was alive. I had made it. The return to civilization was not the triumphant homecoming I might have once imagined. I stumbled out of the woods, a ghost of my former self, my clothes in tatters, my body emaciated, my eyes wide with a terror that no amount of sleep could erase. The first person I encountered, a bewildered hunter, recoiled at the sight of me. He called for help, and soon the flashing lights of an ambulance were cutting through the night. The hospital was a blur of concerned faces, hushed voices, and the sterile scent of antiseptic. They asked questions, endless questions, but the words caught in my throat. How could I explain? How could I tell them about the dire wolves, about the scientists, about being bait in a macabre experiment? They would think I was mad, a victim of exposure and delirium. And perhaps in a way I was. I was discharged eventually, deemed physically recovered, but the scars ran deeper than any cut or bruise. The sounds of the city, once a comforting hum, now felt like a cacophony, a jarring assault on my hypersensitive ears. Every shadow held a lurking threat, every distant dog bark sent a jolt of fear through me. Sleep remained elusive, haunted by the echoing howls and the chilling image of those ancient, predatory eyes. I tried to tell my story to the police, to a therapist, but their faces remained impassive, their eyes filled with a polite skepticism. They offered diagnoses, medications, anything but belief. I am back in the world, but the world I knew is gone. The forest, once a place of peace, is now a living nightmare etched into the very fabric of my being. I see the wolves in every shadow, hear their howls in every gust of wind. The scientists I know are still out there, their twisted experiments continuing, their ancient horrors breeding in the dark heart of the American wilderness. And I, Ilara Vance, am a survivor, yes, but also a prisoner of the echoes that remain, forever haunted by the howling dark.